Hello, I'm James Chapman. I'm Professor of Film Studies at the University of Leicester, and welcome to this Head Start video. There's no set formula for these, so I thought I'd talk about my favourite subject, which is movies. I love movies, and I have the best job in the world, which is teaching film and researching film. And I thought for this little introduction, how better to talk about film than talk about some of my favorite films. So that's what I'm going to do. I've just queued up 10 films. I'm not making any claim that these are the best films, the greatest films ever made, significant works of art. Some of them I think are. Others are really more in the way of personal favorites. But just some of the films that I've been interested and engaged in. And what I've done, I'm showing them not chronologically, but rather roughly in the sequence in which I encountered them as a film enthusiast. And one of the challenges of studying film, particularly if you're interested in the history of film, is that when you look back at the history of the medium, which is, 120 years plus now, you will encounter films out of their strict chronological sequence. So here goes. First up, Lon Hardy. Some of the first films I remember seeing on television were Lon Hardy films, and they're still, for my money, the funniest screen comedians. Not necessarily as critically acclaimed as Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton, for example. Maybe not with the satirical edge of the Marx Brothers, but for sheer humane funniness, I don't think you can really beat Stan and Ollie. I think they were historically significant. They were, of all the great silent comedians, Lon Hardy were really the only ones who successfully made the transition over into talking pictures. So they were already established before talkies arrived. They made that transition in a way that Keaton and Howard Lloyd didn't really manage, and in which Chaplin resisted for a long time. Other comedians who came up, like the Marx Brothers, really came out of the sound period. So I think there's a historical importance to them. This is a still from their Academy Award-winning short film, The Music Box. For those who know your Lon Hardy, this is the one where they try to take the piano up the staircase, and that's the film. It's one of the simplest ideas. It does have a kind of beautiful inevitability about it. The number of times they lose control of the piano and have to, take it up the staircase again. The staircase is still there. I visited it when I was in Los Angeles in 2010, and although the buildings around have changed somewhat, the staircase is still pretty much as it is, though it doesn't, as it happened, lead to 1127 Walnut Avenue. Second film, this is The Dam Busters, British film from 1955. When I was, a boy, I used to read a lot of war comics, not particularly fashionable things these days, but in the 70s, I used to read Victor, Warlord, Commando, and I developed a fascination with the Second World War, in particular, the history of the war. And it was a short step from there to looking at war films. And at that time, there were a lot of British war films that would come on television, particularly on Saturday, Sunday matinee screenings. And I must have seen The Dam Busters, half a dozen times. And it stuck with me. It was always seemed one of the more authentic of the war films of that period. And when I got a bit older and was reading history, my first degree is in history. I'm a historian by background. It does seem to be one of the closest. It's not strictly accurate in every little incident or detail, but there's a sense of authenticity about it. I think even at the age of 8, 9 or whatever, I was able to differentiate between this and more sensational, perhaps more jingoistic adventure movies, Guns of Navarone or Where Eagles Dare, which I also like, but which are obviously of a different kind of entertainment formula. for those of you who haven't seen the Dam Busters and are interested in how this might link into other aspects of film history, one of the fascinating things for me about studying this subject is looking for connections, looking for patterns that repeat. And if you watch the film that I will still insist was called Star Wars, some people now call it Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope. But that wasn't the title when I saw it in the cinema in Britain. It was a 1978 film, not a 1977 film. But if you look at the attack on the Death Star at the end of Star Wars, it's a very similar sort of structure to the attack on the dams at the end of the Dam Busters. You cut back and forth between the control room where people are waiting anxiously and scenes of the raid. You have the attacking spaceships or Lancaster bombers, which are equipped with a particular weapon. They have to hit the target in a particular way from a certain distance. They're facing anti-aircraft fire or lasers in the case of Star Wars. And if you listen carefully, you'll spot precise lines of dialogue that are repeated between the Dam Busters and Star Wars in the climactic scenes. Is that just a coincidence? It's way too close for it to be coincidence. And when you do a little bit of reading, you discover that Gilbert Taylor, the British director of cinematography for Star Wars, actually also did the special effects cinematography for the Dam Busters. And there's your link. We know that George Lucas, at the sort of rough cut stage, before the special effects were complete on Star Wars, spliced in footage from World War II air combat movies, and maybe, just maybe, with Gilbert Taylor's initiative there, this might have been one. So the Dam Busters. 1977, my first ever visit to a cinema to see The Spy Who Loved Me, Roger Moore's third film as James Bond. I'd seen Bond movies on television, so the early Sean Connery films had started being shown, but this was the first film I ever saw in a cinema. If there's ever a film you need to see on the big screen, this is it. I grew up at a time, the late 70s was my formative cinema going years, when there was a shift away from the sort of auteur films of New Hollywood, although I would have been a bit too young to get in to see those anyway, and a return to the cinema of spectacle, new adventure, special effects driven, science fiction movies and so on. So you had the Bond movies, you also had Star Wars, Superman, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Star Trek the Motion Picture, The Black Hole, that sort of period. And it was a great period for the rediscovery of spectacle in cinema. Now, I know Roger Moore is not everyone's idea of James Bond, but he's my James Bond. I don't say he's the best, but I say he is my favourite. I think The Spy Who Loved Me is a film that gets all the balance between the action, the romance, the stunts, the tricked up cars, and that marvellous pre-title sequence with the free fall ski stunt performed by Rick Sylvester, which some people reckon to be, although it's very simple stunt, but in its setup, but one of the best live stunts ever performed in a film. So this was my first film in a cinema. It's always interesting to know what the first films that people saw on the big screen, because I think that does make a difference. The Bridge on the River Kwai, I would have seen this on television when I was maybe, I don't know, 12, something like that. And this might be the first, what I call the first grown-up film I saw, in the sense of being morally and psychologically serious. It's a war picture, but it's also a character study, and it's ambiguous about the ideological values at stake in the war. It's not a straightforward good guys and bad guys, although the Japanese don't come out of it particularly well. But it also, I think, explores the British and to an extent also through William Holden, the American mindset and different attitudes towards masculinity, towards masculinity under stress in particular. It's the first of David Lean's epic period. he followed up with Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago, and a lot of people will argue for Lawrence of Arabia as being Lean's best film. I rate this one, although Lawrence is an excellent film. But I do think there's something quite special about The Bridge on the River Kwai. And as I say, it was the first grown-up film that I'd seen, as opposed to war movies or adventure war movies, those sorts of things. Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai is, I think, the first foreign language film that I saw. I should issue a corrective there. Non-English language film. Of course, if you're Japanese, then it's not Japanese. It's not a foreign language. And this was a time, my early teens. I was, reading about film, taking books out of the library, and starting to be, get interested in seeking out films I read about that had been, critically acclaimed and so on. And this is a film I kept coming across references to. I'd seen The Magnificent Seven, which is a sort of Western remake directed by John Sturges, which is a very good film. But The Seven Samurai is the template of that film in the Japanese samurai genre. Obviously, it's a much deeper, more complex film, I think, than The Magnificent Seven. And as well, what Kurosawa does very well is combine action but also character psychology. It also has a kind of epic feel to it. It's not made in widescreen. It's a black and white film, but it has a kind of epic, sort of mythical quality to it that we see in a lot of Kurosawa's period films. Of course, Kurosawa also is acclaimed for making contemporary films, but it's in the West, perhaps it's these samurai pictures that he's best known for. But anyway, Seven Samurai, I think this was my first foreign language film. It's certainly the first one I sought out, and I saw it as with a lot of films on Channel 4. Which was showing a very diverse diet of films in the 1980s, including representative examples of world cinema that you don't really get on mainstream television anymore. You have to search them out a little bit, which is a shame. Oh, this has always been a favourite. The Thin Man Mgm, 1934. I must have been, 14, 15 when I saw this. I'd seen a couple of William Powell detective comedy films. Powell is the debonair man-at-town hero. Films called Star at Midnight, The Ex-Mrs. Bradford, which are a combination of detective stories and the sort of romantic screwball comedy. And I'd enjoyed them and so on. But I'd read all the time that they were sort of imitations of this film called The Thin Man. So I was really waiting for this film to come on television, and lo and behold, it came on Channel 4. I think it was on late one night, so I set the video recorder, and I watched it twice the next day, and again the day after that. I was just enraptured by it. It's a fast-paced, slick, very witty film. And surprisingly risque in places for a film of 1934. It was made just on the cusp of the stricter enforcement of the production code, and it's a film which the mystery is almost secondary to the banter, and particularly the relationship between the married detectives Nick and Nora Charles. The Thin Man, it's an example of a series film. It spawned, I think, 5 sequels, and the first and second sequels are also pretty good films as well. Like all sequels and series, eventually subject to the law of diminishing returns. But the first film, it was shot by W.S. Van Dyke, Woody Van Dyke, or One Take Woody, as he was known. A very fast director on the floor. Reportedly shot this film in 14 days. When the average schedule of a Hollywood film of this scale might have been about 6 weeks at the time, and you can sense the pace when you watch it. It's a very pacey, fast-moving film, and for me, one of the highlights of the studio era of the classical Hollywood cinema of the 1930s. Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window is the film that I think got me interested in film studies, as opposed to just being somebody who liked movies. It was seeing this film on its reissue. Was reissued in, I think, 1984. I'd seen other Hitchcock films on television. I'd seen Psycho. I'd seen North by Northwest. I'd seen, I think, The 39 Steps from Hitchcock's British period. And so I was quite excited when these, they weren't ever lost films, but films that had not been publicly available for over a decade were reissued following Hitchcock's death. And Rear Window was a knockout to me. I thought it was a very suspenseful film. It's witty. Again, it's sort of a romantic, a mystery thriller. It's very suspenseful at the end. The first time you watch it, I've lost count of the number of times I've seen it now. No longer quite on the edge of my seat, but the technique, of course, which Hitchcock uses, is still the same. And it's a film that really got me going to the library and seeking out academic work on Hitchcock. I must have been about 16, something like that. And a film that, when it was first released in 1954, was not regarded as being particularly significant. It was well received, but was just regarded as a kind of light entertainment. But over the years, has come to be seen as something of a metaphor for cinema. It's about the idea of looking. James Stewart plays a photographer who's broken his leg. He's temporarily confined to a wheelchair in his apartment. He spends the time by much being a peeping Tom and spying on his neighbours. But then it turns out that one of his neighbours might have murdered his wife. And that's where the suspense arises. Tell me what you saw and what you think it means, says his girlfriend Lisa, played by Grace Kelly. And on a personal note, I of course fell in love with Grace Kelly, and well, who wouldn't? That's by the by. But I'm a big Hitchcock fan. I teach a third year optional module on Hitchcock, and Rear Window is, I mean, I'd probably say my favourite Hitchcock film, although there are a lot of them to choose from. But if I had to go for one, I think it would be this. Another favourite film, a British film from 1949, The Third Man, not to be confused with The Thin Man. Most of my own research has actually been on British cinema. I was a relatively late comer to appreciating British films. A lot of the early films I was interested in were classical Hollywood. But certainly by the time I was at university, I was getting interested in British film, and a lot of people cite this as their favourite or the best British film, so I'm not being particularly original or distinctive there, but it is a marvellous film, a Graham Greene script, directed by Carol Reed, one of Britain's best filmmakers, a very metropolitan cast, including here Joseph Cotton, but also Orson Welles, Alida Valli, Trevor Howard, British actor, and set on location in post-war Vienna in the period of the four-power occupation. It's a very atmospheric film, really very much of its time. You get a real sense of location and place and the sort of political and social post-war background. Some marvellous scenes, some crackling dialogue. And it's a film that is worthwhile seeking out to see in the cinema. It is frequently revived in the BFI South Bank at regional film theatres. My wife and I, most recently, we saw it a couple of years ago when we were on holiday in Vienna, and the Berg Kino in Vienna shows it every Sunday afternoon, so we booked to go see The Third Man in Vienna, and that was magnificent. So a film that I heartily recommend. Another British film, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, from 1943. This is by the team of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger. Powell was English, Pressburger was a Hungarian emigre, and they formed a writing, directing team that was active from the end of the 1930s through to the sort of late 1950s, nearly 20 years of filmmaking. Powell and Pressburger are an odd pair. Some of their films at the time were not particularly well received. They were not films like The Dam Busters. They were not characterized by that kind of British school of realism. They were often more fantastical, more colourful, using film technique in a very non-naturalistic way at times. And this film, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, was the first of their Technicolor films. Powell uses Technicolor in a way it's difficult to describe. It's slightly desaturated. It's not like the kind of slightly more garish kind of Technicolor that you get in Hollywood at the same time. And Martin Scorsese was very much influenced by both by the color palette of Powell's films, but also when it came to film Raging Bull, his inspiration for how to stage the fight sequences, which is, you don't show too much of them, was supposedly inspired by a duel that is fought in The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. It's a film that's controversial in its day. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, wanted to suppress it. He felt it would undermine the British war effort because it painted, in his view, a picture of the British Army officer class as being reactionary and backward looking. And the film is much more complex than that, much more nuanced. But one of the reasons I like it is that it does challenge the ideological consensus of British films during the Second World War. Obviously, there were a lot of propaganda films, patriotic movies, and so on. But this is much more complex, not least because it has a very sympathetic characterization of a German character played by the actor Anton Walbach, who is the protagonist's best friend. Here you have Roger Livesey. Livesey never went on to become a major star. He was a very, very fine character actor, and this is his finest hour on film. So I do recommend The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. And last not least, for the time being, this is a film by René Clair, French director, called, well, the English language title is Silence is Golden. This is a film I saw very recently. I saw it in 2018 in Bologna at the Cinema Ritrovato festival, which is a kind of cinephile's delight. And this, for me, was one of the highlights. One of the, you know, it's an old film, but I hadn't seen it before. I knew nothing about it, and it stars Maurice Chevalier. It's a sort of romantic drama with a sort of nostalgic aspect to it. It's looking back. It's about a filmmaker looking back to the early days of filmmaking in Paris. If you've seen films like Martin Scorsese's Hugo, or in a slightly different vein, Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, films about the film industry, films about filmmaking, a quite interesting little subgenre in their own right. But René Clair was a French director. He'd been outside of France since the mid-1930s. He'd worked in Britain, and then during the Second World War was based in Hollywood. Obviously wasn't able to go back during the German occupation. And this was his return to France after the end of the Second World War. And again, it's just a charming, elegant film. I think elegant is the word that describes it. A character study, but also, as I said, a nostalgic and rather affectionate homage to the medium of film that Claire loved, that I loved, that I still love, and that hopefully you're going to love as students at the University of Leicester. Well, thank you for listening to this little video, and I do hope that you are, that we are able to meet in person in the non too distant future.